The story behind the headlines. Every Sunday evening at this time, the National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the American Historical Association, presents Caesar Searchinger in his analysis of the news. In this analysis, Mr. Searchinger draws upon research material especially prepared for these broadcasts by eminent historians. And now, Caesar Searchinger.
Good evening, everybody. Tomorrow, while the Big Four meet in Moscow, the Washington spotlight will be on Greece. At a special gathering of congressional leaders, President Truman will outline our government's program for bolstering that country's economy. To point up the emergency character of this program, the President has canceled his Caribbean trip and his attendance at the Navy's maneuvers. The emergency arose as the result of a warning by the British that they could no longer carry alone the burden of propping up the Greek and Turkish governments and guarding the security of the Eastern Mediterranean. The initial amount required is said to be $250 million. Naturally, this comes at a very inopportune time for the congressional majority, which is trying to trim the budget and bring down taxes with an eye to next year's elections, especially after the $350 million already demanded for European relief. The President may have to send a special message to Congress or even appeal to the country direct. The appeal would be on compassionate grounds, but what it involves for us is a power political venture, possibly historic, in a new sphere, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Hitherto, that region has been considered a British imperial concern. Now it appears we are likely to become partners with Britain, which still provides the actual manpower on the spot. Some congressmen have balked at the idea. Why, asked one of them angrily, and I quote, should we pull Britain's fat out of the fire? But this was an oversimplification, to say the least. The Greek situation is our baby as much as Britain's. As Mr. Cyrus L. Salzburger writes in the New York Times, our obligation to Greece goes back to the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. At that conference, the control over the conduct of Allied and political strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean was assigned to the British, but obviously as part of the grand strategy of the Allied war against the Axis. Greece, from the very first, had been regarded as a vital outpost of the Allies, and the British, you will remember, had sent a force into Greece in the spring of 1941, which tried to stem the Nazi tide at Thermopylae. By so doing, they had jeopardized their position in North Africa and, in consequence, had had to retreat into Egypt before Rommel's Africa Corps. The loss of the British foothold in Greece was a terrible blow to the Allies. It meant Nazi control of the Aegean Sea and the virtual blockade of the Dardanelles. And that made it impossible later on to send supplies to the Russian armies in the Ukraine. Well, times have changed, and our concern over Greece has taken a different slant. In the spring of 1944, the Soviet armies overran most of the Balkans. All Balkan countries but Greece came under Soviet influence. What Churchill had feared when he proposed that the Allies invade the continent via the Balkans had come to pass. That proposal, incidentally, was opposed by us. But in May 1944, Churchill and Stalin agreed on a separation of occupation spheres. Romania and Bulgaria were left to the Russians. Greece was assigned to the British. Yugoslavia was to be 50-50, but that didn't work out. Well, the British have been in Greece ever since, much to the chagrin, by the way, of American liberals. The liberal line was that the British were in Greece in order to support the discredited monarchy and in order to preserve their domination of the Eastern Mediterranean, a key to British power in the Middle East. Unfortunately, the more recent course of events in Greece seemed to bear out this theory. The British were committed to George II, the exiled king. They were against the rising leftist movement, which derived its moral prestige from its heroic underground resistance and its part in the liberation. This movement, the EAM, was by no means all communist. At one time, it comprised the vast majority of all patriotic Greeks. But the issue was more sharply joined after the British troops moved in and supported the government which the left wing regarded as reactionary. There was a short, sharp civil war beginning with the so-called Athens massacre in December 1944. This led to a truce and to an agreement that the king should not return until the people had voted for him in a plebiscite. As you know, the king has since won the plebiscite and has returned from exile as he did once before. The rest is recent history, but too confused to be easily remembered. The upshot of it is that civil strife has not ceased, and that armed bands of the People's Army, the Elas, have continued their guerrilla warfare in various parts of Greece, especially in the north. Today, those armed bands in the north are getting support and training from the Yugoslav, Albanian, and Bulgarian partisans across the border. At the same time, these three Balkan countries, now satellites of Russia, have advanced border claims against Greece. Behind these claims is the power of Soviet Russia, which desires an outlet for her satellites on the Aegean Sea, the very sea which the Nazis dominated during the war. It is obvious that Greece has become an object of power politics, but it's important for us to realize that we are as much concerned in this as the British. We are therefore not merely pulling Britain's fat or chestnuts out of the fire. Just as in the case of Palestine, we are not willing to have the British move out because of what is involved. Strategically, Greece and the Greek islands control the eastern entrance, the entrance to the Dardanelles, which Russia wants to protect, and the sea approaches to the Middle East, with its vast resources in oil. So important has Greece become to us that as early as 1942, according to Mr. Sulzberger, our ambassador to Greece, Lincoln McVeigh, wanted an American commander to head an Anglo-American force for the liberation of Greece. It was Mr. McVeigh, too, who thought up the idea of sending our Pacific Fleet through the Mediterranean on its way home. We did, in fact, send a flotilla, including the battleship Missouri and the aircraft carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt, to make courtesy calls all the way from the Red Sea to Istanbul and Athens. By so doing, says Mr. Sulzberger, we served notice on Russia that, quote, we were setting up a great power frontier along the northern borders of Iran, Turkey, and Greece. United States diplomacy supported these countries' governments, and the Russian-sponsored Azerbaijan regime in northern Iran collapsed under the weight of this counterbalance. End of quote. But actually, Britain was still holding the bag in the whole area. Lend-lease to Turkey was cleared through the British. They trained the Turkish Air Force, and the British troops remained in Greece. Well, today the British themselves are financially unable to bear that burden alone. But what about Greece? For the Greeks, the war lasted almost as long as for the British, and Greece is a poor country with no mineral resources and only 15% of its land arable. The Greeks have probably suffered more than any single nation from the war, its devastation and starvation. And war was followed by internal violence, excesses on the left, and persecution from the right. Even a freely accepted and efficient government could not have restored order and solvency without massive outside help. The successive Greek governments have been inept, inefficient, and even corrupt. The civil service has been purged of all leftist sympathizers, and thousands have been arrested and deported to the islands as political prisoners. This is one reason why tax collections are slow and few people subscribe to the government loans. Inflation is rife and black markets rampant. Rationing has failed because there is no confidence in the government or in its currency. So, to the British, it must have seemed as though they were pouring money into a bottomless trough. Our own government a year ago lent $25 million to Greece with a warning that the Greeks must put their financial house in order if they want more. Since then, the border guerrillas have increased their activities in the north. Last fall, Premier Tsaldaris arrived in this country to appeal to the United Nations to stop this state of undeclared war and to help Greece in her tragic situation. A United Nations commission was sent to Greece and is now extracting an endless string of testimony. At the same time, we have sent an economic mission headed by Paul Porter, who has succeeded thus far in getting the number of Greek ministries reduced from 43 to 15. Greek governments since the king's return have been 100% royalist, extreme rightist, and ineffectual. Half-hearted attempts to bring in the opposition have finally resulted in a coalition government headed by a non-party royalist, Demetrius Maximus, whom time characterizes as a frail, ailing ex-banker. The new government has promised to review the case of the untried political prisoners and has actually begun by releasing the women and children. The Greeks, whose ancestors laid the foundations of democracy, have certainly not been giving a fair example of it in recent months. Nor have the British, who insisted on the restoration of the monarchy, any reason for pride. The Greek government has now appealed directly to the United States for material aid, the means of self-support in the future, and the means of restoring tranquility. Will we succeed together where the British alone have failed? In considering that failure, we should not forget that it was Britain, above all other countries, that helped modern Greece to independence over a century ago. Britain and the other European powers established Greece as nearly as possible in their own image, as a constitutional monarchy with an alien dynasty. Today, that form of semi-democracy is played out in Europe. Today, the European countries, ruined by war, are struggling to restore an economy on modern lines, to achieve economic security with personal freedom if possible, but security first of all. The challenge to the United States, says the New York Tribune, is the task of making free enterprise democracy possible in Greece by giving the country a viable basis on which to stand and from which to supply the human needs of its people. But, the paper continues, this is not a question of either 19th century romantic imperialism nor of a mere altruistic rescue expedition. Greece is one of the decisive points at which the future shape of the world will be determined. Whether or not we can find the confidence and energy to export our freedoms, our skills, our productive power, as Britain once did, will largely determine the next phase in world history and will certainly determine the fate of our own system. The Greek crisis is admittedly only a beginning, but if we lack the courage and the foresight even to make the beginning, then the end for ourselves will be easily predictable. Strength is given in this world to be used. Hoarded, it evaporates. Now, I'm quoting this not as my own opinion, but to show the direction of conservative opinion in America today. At least the part of conservative opinion that is anti-isolationist. Some might consider it an invitation to imperialism, but to others it would be just plain political realism. It is now certain that the British are no longer able or willing to carry the burden of empire and world order that they have carried in the past. Americans are now realizing that we, too, have been beneficiaries of her imperialism, and that wherever Britain relaxes her hold, this burden will be either shifted to our shoulders or the slack will be taken up somewhere else. This is a decisive moment in world history. The decision must eventually be made by the American people, and the decision inevitably will be made on ideological grounds. For today, there are two economic systems contending for worldwide acceptance. Meantime, we are learning, like the British before us, that power cannot be exercised without responsibility, nor can it be exercised without sacrifice. That's something to remember when you fill out your income tax returns this week. Good night.
The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations, in cooperation with the American Historical Association, have presented Caesar Searchinger. Next week at this time, Mr. Searchinger will be back with another story behind the headlines. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.